August 30th, 1945. Atsugi Airfield, Kanagawa Prefecture, Japan. The air tasted of ash and uncertainty. 72-year-old Nakamura Hideo stood at the edge of his village, fingers wrapped around the wooden handle of his farming hoe, watching the American transport planes descend through the overcast sky like mechanical birds from another world. The sound of their engines, a deep, thrumming resonance that seemed to shake the earth itself, rolled across the rice paddies and through the skeletal remains of what had once been a thriving agricultural community. Behind him, hidden in the shadows of partially collapsed homes, his neighbors watched in silence. They had been told for 4 years that the Americans were demons, that they would rape and murder, that they would burn what little remained of Japan to cinders. Nakamura's granddaughter, 8-year-old Yuki, clutched his worn cotton trousers, her small body trembling not from cold but from the bone-deep fear that had been cultivated in her since she could understand language. The Americans were coming, and the villagers of Yamatomura waited to die. What they did not know, what they could not know as those massive C-54 Skymaster aircraft touched down on the runway the Japanese had built for kamikaze operations, was that the Americans were not coming to take vengeance. They were coming with something more confusing than cruelty, more disorienting than violence. They were coming with medicine. They were coming with food. They were coming with chocolate bars and powdered milk and sulfa drugs and penicillin, with canned rations and blankets and soap, with the bewildering apparatus of a nation that, even in victory, could not help but try to heal what it had broken. In the pockets of thousands of American GIs were photographs of their own children, their own farms, their own mothers, and orders from General Douglas MacArthur that were as revolutionary as they were explicit. You are not here to punish the Japanese people. You are here to show them a better way. The occupation that was about to begin would transform Japan more profoundly than any military defeat. But it would begin here, in villages like Yamatomura, with small gestures that would shatter ideologies as thoroughly as B-29s had shattered cities, with a soldier offering a starving child a Hershey's bar, with a medic treating an old woman's infected wound, with the slow, painful recognition that the enemy was not a demon after all, but simply a man who happened to have more than enough to share. To understand the shock that rippled through Japanese villages in the autumn of 1945, one must first understand the depths of deprivation to which the Japanese people had descended. By August, when the emperor's radio address announced the unthinkable, surrender, Japan was a nation on the edge of starvation. 4 years of total war had stripped the country bare. The American submarine blockade had been ruthlessly effective, sinking merchant vessels faster than Japan could replace them, cutting the home islands off from the rice of Korea, the oil of the Dutch East Indies, the rubber and tin of Malaya. Domestic rice production had collapsed as young men were conscripted and fertilizer diverted to explosives manufacture. The average daily caloric intake for civilians in the summer of 1945 was estimated at 1,200 calories, barely enough to sustain basic metabolic function, far below what was needed for physical labor or growth. In rural villages like Yamatomura, located 30 kilometers southwest of Tokyo, conditions were catastrophic. The 1945 rice harvest had been devastated by a combination of labor shortages, lack of fertilizer, and unseasonable weather. Families subsisted on whatever they could forage: wild plants, tree bark, sawdust mixed with what little rice flour remained. Protein was a memory. Fish were scarce. Livestock had been slaughtered long ago, and the government ration system had effectively collapsed. Children exhibited the classic signs of malnutrition: distended bellies, thinning hair, skin stretched tight over prominent bones. Tuberculosis, always endemic in Japan, was spreading unchecked. Dysentery claimed the weak and the young. Medical supplies were non-existent. Sulfanilamide, the basic antibacterial drug, had been unavailable for civilian use since 1943. Bandages were reused until they disintegrated. Anesthesia for surgery was often nothing more than sake, and a wooden dowel to bite down on. And yet, through all of this, the villagers had been sustained by a narrative fed to them through radio broadcasts, through mandatory neighborhood association meetings, through the pronouncements of local officials. The Americans, when they came, would be worse. The propaganda had been relentless and specific. American soldiers would desecrate shrines, would violate women, would torture men for sport. The government had distributed poison to households, encouraging civilians to commit suicide rather than face capture. In Okinawa, thousands of civilians had thrown themselves from cliffs or detonated grenades rather than surrender to American forces. The message was clear: death was preferable to American occupation. Nakamura Hideo, born in the Meiji era when Japan was just beginning its transformation into a modern nation, had believed little of the propaganda. He was old enough to remember when American missionaries had run schools in Japan, when American technology and education had been admired. But his daughter-in-law, Keiko, whose husband had died aboard a destroyer in the Philippine Sea, believed every word. So did most of the younger villagers. They had known nothing but war, nothing but scarcity, nothing but the certainty that the Americans were subhuman monsters who would inflict upon Japan the same horrors that Japanese forces had inflicted upon China and Southeast Asia. It was projection, though they did not have that word for it. It was the assumption that the enemy must be as brutal as one's own side had been. The first Americans to enter Yamato Mura arrived on September 3, 1945, 4 days after the formal surrender ceremony, aboard the USS Missouri. They came in a convoy of jeeps and trucks, part of a broader sweep to establish control and assess conditions in the towns and villages surrounding Tokyo. The villagers, who had watched the convoys approach with mounting dread, had hidden the younger women and girls in root cellars and back rooms. The old men and boys stood in the village square, tools in hand, not weapons exactly, but implements that could serve as such if the rumors proved true. Nakamura stood at the front, hoe still gripped in his weathered hands, his face arranged in an expression of stoic acceptance. If death came, it would find him standing. The lead jeep stopped 20 meters from the assembled villagers. The engine idled for a moment, then cut off. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then the door opened and an American soldier stepped out. He was young, perhaps 23, 24, with the kind of build that suggested he had grown up with abundant food, tall and broad-shouldered in a way that Japanese men rarely were. He wore the olive-drab uniform of the U.S. Army, an M1 carbine slung across his back. On his helmet was a painted white cross, a medic. He walked forward slowly, hands visible and empty, palms forward in a gesture that transcended language. Behind him, other soldiers dismounted, but they did not fan out in tactical formation. They did not level weapons. They simply stood, waiting. The medic stopped 3 meters from Nakamura. He was close enough now that Nakamura could see his face, sun-bronzed, with light eyes that might have been blue or gray, difficult to tell in the overcast light. The American said something in English, words that meant nothing to the villagers. Then he reached slowly into his jacket pocket. Every muscle in Nakamura's body tensed. This was it. The knife, the pistol, the beginning of the atrocity. But what the American pulled out was a chocolate bar. A Hershey's bar in its distinctive brown wrapper, slightly melted from body heat. He held it out, not to Nakamura, but to Yuki, who had crept out from behind her grandfather and now stood staring at the American with huge, dark eyes. The medic smiled. It was not a predatory smile, not the grin of a man about to commit violence. It was gentle, almost sad, the smile of someone who had seen too much suffering and wanted, desperately, to alleviate a small piece of it. He waggled the chocolate bar slightly, an offering. Yuki looked up at her grandfather. Nakamura, his mind struggling to reconcile 4 years of propaganda with the evidence before his eyes, gave a slight nod. Yuki reached out, fingers trembling, and took the chocolate. The American's smile widened. He said something else in English. Good girl, perhaps, or it's okay, and then straightened, turning to address the other villagers. What happened next would be recounted in Yamato Mura for generations. The Americans unloaded crates from their trucks, not weapons, not torture implements, food, medical supplies. Canned rations, Spam, corned beef, beans, fruit cocktail, and heavy syrup. 50-pound sacks of rice, stamped with U.S. government markings. Boxes of powdered milk, cartons of cigarettes, and medical supplies. Sulfa drugs, aspirin, bandages, iodine, even a small portable X-ray machine. The medic, whose name was Private First Class James Kowalski from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, set up a triage station in the village meeting hall. Through gestures and the few words of Japanese he had picked up from a phrase book, he indicated that anyone who was sick or injured should come forward. No one moved. The villagers stood frozen, unable to process what they were seeing. Then old Nakamura, driven by a desperation stronger than fear, stepped forward. He pointed to his daughter-in-law, Keiko, who was running a fever, her face flushed and her breathing labored. Kowalski nodded immediately, gesturing for her to approach. Keiko hesitated, then shuffled forward, supported by Nakamura. The American medic examined her quickly, felt her forehead, checked her pulse, looked at her throat. He pulled out a packet of sulfanilamide tablets, explained through gestures how many she should take and when. He gave the packet to Nakamura, then reached into his pack and pulled out a canteen. Fresh water, clean and clear. He offered it to Keiko, who drank as if she had been wandering a desert. That broke the dam. Within minutes, villagers were crowding forward. The sick, the injured, the chronically ill who had been suffering in silence because there was no treatment available. Kowalski and his fellow medics worked steadily, treating infected wounds, distributing vitamins to malnourished children, setting a broken arm that had healed wrong because there had been no one to set it properly. They worked without payment, without expectation of gratitude, with a matter-of-fact efficiency that was more shocking to the villagers than cruelty would have been. These were the demons. These young men who bandaged wounds and gave medicine to children. The scene in Yamato Mura was replicated across Japan in the autumn of 1945. The American occupation, which would eventually number over 350,000 troops, fanned out across the home islands with orders that were unprecedented in the history of military occupations. General MacArthur, appointed Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, had issued directives that reflected a philosophy shaped by his own complex relationship with Asia, by his understanding that crushing Japan militarily was only half the battle. The other half was winning the peace, transforming Japan from a militaristic empire into a stable, democratic nation that would not threaten regional security again. And MacArthur understood, with an insight that bordered on genius, that this transformation had to begin at the most basic human level, with food, with medicine, with the small gestures that demonstrated American intentions. The scale of American aid that poured into Japan in the months following surrender was staggering. By December 1945, the U.S. Army was distributing 1,500 tons of food per day to Japanese civilians. By the spring of 1946, that figure had increased to 3,000 tons per day. The food came from American surplus stocks, rations that had been stockpiled for the invasion of Japan that never happened, agricultural products purchased from American farmers under Lend-Lease agreements. Rice from California, wheat from Kansas, canned goods from factories in the Midwest. The cost to American taxpayers was enormous, running into hundreds of millions of dollars at a time when the U.S. economy was transitioning from wartime to peacetime production and faced its own challenges. There were voices in the United States who questioned this generosity. Why should American resources go to feed a people who had attacked Pearl Harbor, who had committed atrocities in China and the Philippines, who had fought with fanatical determination until the very end? The letters to editors, the congressional speeches, the debates in newspaper columns all asked the same question. Why help them? The answer, articulated most clearly by MacArthur but shared by the Truman administration, was pragmatic as much as humanitarian. A starving, desperate Japan would be a breeding ground for communism, would be vulnerable to Soviet influence, would remain unstable and potentially aggressive. Feeding Japan was not charity. It was investment in regional security and the creation of a democratic ally in Asia. But on the ground, in villages like Yamato Mura, the soldiers distributing food and medicine rarely thought in geopolitical terms. They were young men, most of them conscripts, who had fought their way across the Pacific, through Guadalcanal, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and had seen enough death to last a lifetime. Many had lost friends, had seen comrades blown apart by artillery or burned alive in tank battles. They had every reason to hate the Japanese. And yet, confronted with starving children and sick old men, confronted with the reality of civilian suffering that mirrored the suffering of their own families back home during the Depression, they responded not with vengeance but with the basic human impulse to help. Private Kowalski, the medic in Yamato Mura, would later write in a letter to his mother, "Ma, you wouldn't believe what it's like here. The kids are so skinny you can see their ribs. They've got nothing. When we give them food, they cry. Not because they're sad, but because they can't believe someone is being kind to them. We were told they were monsters, but they're just people. Scared, hungry people. It makes you think about what we were fighting for. Not to kill them, but to stop the ones who were using them." The chocolate bar became, in those first weeks of occupation, an accidental symbol of the collision between two ideologies. For Japanese children, who had not tasted sugar in years, whose rations had been reduced to millet and sweet potato and whatever could be scavenged, a Hershey's bar was a revelation. The sweetness was almost painful, overwhelming senses that had adapted to deprivation. But more than the taste, it was what the chocolate represented. Abundance, casualness, the idea that a soldier could carry something so valuable and give it away without thought, without expecting anything in return. The Hershey's bar had been part of American military rations since the early 1940s, developed to provide quick energy and boost morale. The D-ration chocolate bar was designed to withstand high temperatures, to be nutritious and calorie-dense. By 1945, Hershey was producing 24 million bars per week for military use. To American soldiers, the chocolate bar was ordinary, unremarkable, something they often gave away because they preferred cigarettes or chewing gum. To Japanese civilians, it was an object of almost magical properties, not just because of what it was, but because of what it implied about the nation that could afford to give such things to its soldiers, who could then afford to give them away to enemy civilians. Yuki, Nakamura's granddaughter, did not eat her chocolate bar immediately. She carried it back to the root cellar where the other children were hiding and broke it into 8 pieces, one for each child. They ate the chocolate slowly, reverently, sitting in the darkness and passing around that brown wrapper like it was a sacred text. None of them spoke. They were trying to reconcile the impossible. The Americans were supposed to kill them, but instead had given them the most wonderful thing they had ever tasted. Years later, Yuki would remember that moment as the beginning of her understanding that what she had been taught was a lie, that the world was more complex and more generous than the propaganda had allowed. The chocolate bar recurs again and again in the oral histories and memoirs of Japanese civilians who lived through the occupation. It appears in Yoshida Shigeru's accounts of post-war reconstruction, in letters preserved in the archives of the National Diet Library, in the testimony recorded by American occupation authorities as they tried to assess the effectiveness of their policies. The chocolate bar, more than speeches or political reforms, more than new constitutions or democratic institutions, was the first crack in the ideological edifice that had sustained Japanese militarism. Because it was evidence, tangible and undeniable, that the Americans possessed a surplus so vast they could give away luxuries, and that they chose to give rather than hoard or destroy. By October 1945, Private Kowalski and his unit had moved on to other villages, but they left behind a medical clinic staffed by Japanese civilians and supplied with American medicine. Young men far from home with all the flaws that implies. But the overall tenor of the occupation in rural areas was defined not by the exceptions, but by the daily routine of aid and assistance. Nakamura, who had lived through the Meiji Restoration, the Russo-Japanese War, the annexation of Korea, the invasion of China, and the catastrophic Pacific War, found himself at 72 reassessing beliefs he had held for decades. He had been taught that the Western powers were imperialists who sought to subjugate Asia, that Japan's expansion was defensive, a necessary response to Western encirclement. The propaganda of the 1930s and 1940s had portrayed America as racist, plutocratic, decadent, a nation of individualists who cared nothing for honor or duty. And yet here were these American soldiers, sharing their food, treating Japanese sick without payment, rebuilding infrastructure that American bombs had destroyed. The cognitive dissonance was painful. If the Americans were not what he had been told, then what else was a lie? He was not alone in this struggle. Across Japan, millions of civilians were grappling with the same questions. The emperor, in his surrender broadcast, had spoken of enduring the unendurable and bearing the unbearable. But he had not prepared his people for the possibility that the occupation might be bearable, even beneficial. The Japanese government had expected brutality. They had received aid. They had prepared for subjugation. They had encountered pragmatic generosity. It was, in its way, more destabilizing than military defeat. Defeat could be explained through superior enemy firepower, through the atomic bombs, through the Soviet entry into the war. But generosity, that required a reassessment of fundamental assumptions about the nature of the enemy, about the nature of war itself, about the ideologies that had driven Japan into the abyss. The food shipments from America continued through 1946 and into 1947, a lifeline that prevented mass starvation. The Japanese domestic agricultural system slowly began to recover, aided by land reforms implemented by the occupation authorities that broke up the large estates and distributed land to tenant farmers. These reforms, some of the most radical in Japanese history, were imposed by MacArthur's staff and implemented with surprising efficiency. The goal was not just to feed Japan, but to create a rural class with a stake in the new democratic system, farmers who owned their land and would resist communist appeals. But in the immediate aftermath of surrender, it was the basic provision of food and medicine that mattered most. The American Army operated a massive relief program, distributing not just rations but seeds for planting, fertilizer, farming tools. They rebuilt irrigation systems damaged by bombing, provided technical assistance for agricultural recovery, established feeding programs for children in schools. The scale of effort was unprecedented for an occupying power. Historically, occupations had been extractive. The conqueror took what he wanted, imposed punitive reparations, left the conquered population to fend for itself. The American occupation of Japan operated on a different principle. That stability required prosperity, that democracy required a baseline of material security, that you could not build a peaceful nation on the foundation of starvation and resentment. The Japanese response to this generosity was complex. There was gratitude, yes, but also confusion and a kind of humiliation. To be fed by the enemy was to acknowledge dependency, to accept that Japan could not care for its own people. For a culture that prized self-sufficiency and honor, this was a bitter pill. Some Japanese officials resented the aid, seeing it as a form of control, a way to make Japan compliant and subordinate. Others recognized it for what it was. The difference between survival and collapse. The statistics tell the story. In the winter of 1945-46, mortality rates in Japanese cities were projected to exceed 50 per thousand, a humanitarian catastrophe. By the spring of 1946, due largely to American food shipments, those rates had stabilized at near pre-war levels. Hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians, perhaps millions, owed their lives to American aid. Private James Kowalski returned to Milwaukee in March 1946, his tour of duty complete. He brought with him a small carved wooden Buddha that Nakamura Hideo had given him, not as payment, but as a gesture of respect, a way of saying thank you in a relationship where language was still a barrier. Kowalski kept that Buddha on his mantle for the rest of his life, a reminder of the months he spent in Japan, of the villagers he had treated, of the children who had crowded around him, hoping for chocolate or chewing gum. He rarely spoke about his wartime service. He had seen combat in the Philippines, had been part of the invasion of Luzon, had lost friends to Japanese snipers and artillery. But he spoke often, especially in his later years, about the occupation, about Yamato Mura, about the old man who had given him the Buddha. "I don't think they ever understood why we helped them," he told an interviewer in 1992 when he was 71 years old. "Hell, half the time I didn't understand it myself. We'd been fighting them for years, they'd killed so many of our guys. But when you see a kid who's starving, you don't think about politics. You just give them food." I think that's what MacArthur understood, that you can't build peace on revenge. You have to give people a reason to believe things can get better. The chocolate bars and the medicine, that was us telling them, "We're not here to destroy you. We're here to help you become something different." The Buddha that Nakamura gave to Kowalski had belonged to his family for 3 generations, a small wooden figure carved in the Edo period, representing Jizo Bisatsu, the protector of children and travelers. For Nakamura to give such an object to an American, to a former enemy, was an act of profound significance. It was an acknowledgement that the American had protected his family in a way that his own government had not, that the occupation authorities had provided what the Japanese military state had failed to provide: basic security, food, medicine, a path forward. The gift was also a prayer, a hope that the future would be gentler than the past, that the children of Japan and the children of America would know each other as something other than enemies. By 1948, the immediate crisis had passed. Japan's agricultural production was recovering. The land reforms were taking effect, and rice harvests were returning to pre-war levels. American food aid continued, but in decreasing amounts as Japanese self-sufficiency increased. The occupation shifted its focus from emergency relief to political and economic reconstruction, the writing of a new constitution, the purge of militarists from public life, the promotion of labor unions and democratic institutions. But the memory of those first months, when American soldiers had distributed food and medicine to a population that had been taught to fear and hate them, remained central to the Japanese experience of the occupation. In Yamato Mura, the medical clinic established by Private Kowalski and his fellow medics grew into a permanent facility, staffed by Japanese doctors but still supplied in part by American aid organizations and pharmaceutical companies. Keiko, whose life had been saved by sulfanilamide, trained as a nurse's assistant and worked at the clinic for 30 years. Yuki, who had received the chocolate bar, grew up in a Japan that was radically different from the one her grandfather had known, democratic, prosperous, allied with the United States. She would eventually attend university, an opportunity that would have been unthinkable for a woman of her class in pre-war Japan, and became a teacher. She taught her students about the war, about the mistakes that had been made, about the suffering that resulted. And she taught them about the chocolate bar, about the American medic who had smiled and offered kindness when kindness was least expected. The transformation of Japan from defeated enemy to democratic ally is often attributed to grand political initiatives. The MacArthur Constitution, the land reforms, the purge of militarists, the promotion of industrial development. These were all important, but the foundation of that transformation was laid in thousands of small moments: a medic treating an infected wound, a soldier sharing his rations, a truck convoy delivering rice to a starving village. These moments, repeated across the country, demonstrated in the most concrete terms that the Americans were not what the propaganda had claimed, that the occupation was not an exercise in revenge but an attempt, however imperfect, to build something new. The contrast between Japanese expectations and American actions created a psychological shock that reverberated through Japanese society for years. The propaganda had been so relentless, so specific in its portrayal of American brutality, that the reality of American generosity was literally unbelievable at first. In the early weeks of the occupation, Japanese police expected to be overwhelmed with reports of American atrocities. They prepared special forms for documenting rapes, murders, looting. Those forms, archived in the National Police Agency records, remain largely blank. There were incidents. Any army of 350,000 men will produce bad actors, but they were exceptions, not the rule. The expected wave of atrocities never materialized. This absence of expected horror was, paradoxically, destabilizing. The Japanese had been psychologically prepared for suffering. They were not prepared for generosity. They had been taught that sacrifice for the emperor was the highest virtue. They were confronted with an enemy who sacrificed for abstract principles like democracy and human rights. They had been told that Americans were individualistic and selfish. They encountered soldiers who shared their own food with hungry children. Every interaction that contradicted the propaganda was a small hammer blow against the ideological structure that had sustained Japanese militarism. For many Japanese, particularly the older generation who had lived through the entire arc of Japan's imperial expansion, the cognitive dissonance was too great. They retreated into denial, insisting that the American generosity was a trick, a ploy to make Japan compliant before the real subjugation began. But for the younger generation, for children like Yuki who had no strong investment in the old ideology, the American behavior was a revelation. If the Americans were not what they had been told, then perhaps democracy was not a Western perversion but a viable system. Perhaps individual rights were not a threat to social harmony, but a foundation for a different kind of society. Perhaps Japan's militarism had been not a noble crusade, but a catastrophic mistake. The symbolism of the chocolate bar extended beyond its immediate material value. In the years following the war, as Japan began its remarkable economic recovery, the chocolate bar became a touchstone in popular memory, a symbol of the moment when everything changed, when the certainty of propaganda collided with the reality of American behavior. It appears in films, in novels, in the memoirs of the occupation generation. Novelist Nasaka Akiyuki, who survived the firebombing of Kobe as a child, wrote about receiving chocolate from an American soldier and the confusion it produced. "I hated them, they had killed my mother, but the chocolate was sweet and I was so hungry. How do you hate someone who feeds you?" The chocolate bar represented abundance in a way that Japanese civilians found almost incomprehensible. Japan, even at the height of its imperial power, had never been an abundant society. Resources were always limited, always carefully rationed, always subject to control by authority. The concept of surplus, of having so much that you could afford to give things away, was foreign. The American soldiers, with their casual generosity, their wasteful discarding of half-eaten rations, their apparent indifference to material goods, were walking advertisements for an economic system that the Japanese had been taught was on the verge of collapse. Marxist-influenced Japanese intellectuals had predicted that American capitalism would crumble under its own contradictions, that the Great Depression was the beginning of inevitable decline. Instead, they were confronted with evidence of staggering productivity and wealth. This material abundance was not accidental. It was the product of a specific economic and political system, market capitalism combined with democratic governance, regulated but not controlled by government, innovative and adaptive. The chocolate bar was the edible embodiment of that system. And for many Japanese, especially those who would go on to lead Japan's post-war economic miracle, the lesson was clear. The system that could produce such abundance was worth studying, worth emulating, worth adapting to Japanese circumstances. The economic policies that would transform Japan into the world's second-largest economy had their intellectual origins in the occupation period, in the recognition that American prosperity was not an accident, but the result of specific choices about how to organize society and economy. Nakamura Hideo died in 1953, at the age of 80, having witnessed the complete transformation of his country from feudal backwater to imperial power, to defeated nation to emerging democracy. In his final years, he often sat on the porch of his rebuilt home, reconstructed with assistance from occupation authorities after the original had been damaged by fire, and watched the village children play. They were healthier than children had been in his youth, better fed, taller. The clinic was still operating, now fully staffed and equipped. The rice paddies were productive again, the irrigation system repaired, the land distributed among small farmers who worked with an energy born of ownership. American soldiers no longer patrolled the village. Most occupation forces had withdrawn by 1952, when the San Francisco Peace Treaty restored Japanese sovereignty, but their legacy was everywhere. He thought often about Private Kowalski, about the moment when the young American medic had offered chocolate to Yuki, about the weeks when Americans had treated sick villagers without payment or expectation of gratitude. He had come to understand in his final years that he had witnessed something historically rare, an occupation that sought to build rather than extract, that aimed at transformation rather than subjugation. It was not perfect, no human endeavor is, but it was different from every other occupation in human history, and it had worked. Japan was not a puppet state or a resentful subject. It was becoming a genuine democracy, allied with America not through force but through shared interests and, increasingly, shared values. On the day he died, Yuki sat beside his bed, now a young woman of 16 holding his hand. She asked him as he drifted in and out of consciousness what he wanted her to remember. His answer, whispered in a voice worn thin by age and illness, was simple. Remember that they could have destroyed us and chose to help us instead. Remember the chocolate. Remember that the future can be different from the past. Epilogue. There is a museum in Tokyo, established in 1999, dedicated to the occupation period. Among its exhibits is a single Hershey's bar wrapper, preserved in a climate-controlled display case, yellowed with age and torn at one corner. The placard explains that this wrapper was kept by a woman from a small village near Tokyo, a woman who received the chocolate bar from an American soldier on September 3, 1945, when she was 8 years old. She kept the wrapper her entire life, through marriage and children and career, through Japan's rise to economic superpower status, through the alliance that would make Japan and America partners in ways unimaginable in 1945. She donated it to the museum in 1998, a year before she died, with a note explaining why it mattered to her. This wrapper represents the moment I learned that the enemy could be kind, that war does not define who we must be to each other, that the future is not bound by the past. The chocolate bar, in the end, was more powerful than any weapon. It could not conquer territory or destroy armies, but it could do something more difficult. It could change minds. It could plant seeds of doubt in an ideology built on hatred and fear. It could demonstrate, in a way that words never could, that abundance need not lead to cruelty, that strength could coexist with compassion, that victory could be gracious rather than vengeful. The Americans who distributed chocolate bars and medicine to Japanese villagers in the autumn of 1945 were not saints. They were ordinary young men who had fought a brutal war and wanted nothing more than to go home. But they were also, whether they knew it or not, revolutionary actors in a grand strategic experiment. The attempt to turn an enemy into a friend, to transform a militaristic empire into a peaceful democracy, to prove that the values they had fought for, freedom, dignity, opportunity, were not just propaganda but principles that could guide policy. That experiment succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. Modern Japan, for all its challenges and contradictions, is a testament to what is possible when victors choose to invest in their former enemies rather than grind them into the dust. The alliance between Japan and the United States, one of the most stable and consequential in the post-war world, was built on the foundation of those early interactions. The medic treating the sick, the soldier sharing his rations, the steady demonstration that American power could be used to heal as well as to harm. And it began with a chocolate bar, offered by a young medic to a frightened child in a devastated village, in the uncertain days when the future was unwritten and everything seemed possible. That small gesture, multiplied by thousands across a broken nation, changed the trajectory of history. It proved that the arc of war need not bend toward endless revenge, that enemies can become partners, that the choice to be generous in victory is not weakness but the highest form of strategic wisdom. The chocolate bar, melted and consumed 75 years ago, is gone. But its legacy persists, in the democratic institutions of Japan, in the alliance that has kept East Asia stable for 3/4 of a century, in the memory of a generation that learned that the world can be transformed not just by weapons, but by the simple, revolutionary act of choosing kindness when cruelty is expected. That is the truth that Nakamura Hideo wanted his granddaughter to remember. That is the truth that the chocolate bar, in all its mundane materiality, represented. And that is the truth that echoes through the decades, a reminder that even in the aftermath of total war, even in the ruins of empire, the future remains open, if we have the courage to choose it.